it comes to working on your project cars, I'm sure many of you can relate to the fact that sometimes, whether you want it to or not, sometimes you end up going one step back before going two steps forward. And in today's video, that is exactly the case. Today, we're going to be replacing a part that I broke on this car over 3 months ago when I was doing the cooling system overhaul. And while we have some of those parts out of the car, we're actually going to be installing another part that should give me some real-time live data as to the overall health of the car, so I can avoid hopefully anything catastrophic happening while this car is out on track. And so it should be pretty worthwhile. It should be pretty cool. I'm excited to get it in the car, and yeah, it should be a fun episode. So let's dive into the engine bay so I can show you guys what we have going on. Here we go. Over the last 6 months, I have slowly been chipping away at mostly small but overall important projects on the E36 M3 in preparation of getting out on track for the very first time. And one of, if not the most important areas to be addressed on these cars for that kind of driving is unquestionably the cooling system. So, after ordering somewhere close to probably 95% of every possible cooling system component that exists on this car, about 3 months ago, over the span of a weekend, I finally dove into what most would consider the most important area to address on these cars: its cooling system. So, after about 3 days spent refreshing the M3's cooling system, I was not only excited but relieved to finally have the car back together and running. That is, of course, until I noticed water leaking from a thermostat housing. Now at this point, I assumed I had installed something incorrectly, and also assumed it was going to be a somewhat simple and rather quick fix. So, after removing the housing and double checking online, I realized I had in fact installed the thermostat O-ring incorrectly. I cleaned everything up and again reinstalled the thermostat O-ring, and thermostat housing, and this time in the correct order. And of course started to bleed the cooling system, except yet again, I had water leaking from the thermostat housing. So off everything came now for the third time, and this time I did finally find the admittedly rookie mistake I had made. Now something I hadn't initially mentioned was that when I was installing the new thermostat housing the first time, as I was tightening the bolts, there was a moment in which I thought I had maybe snapped one of them. I had heard a rather unpleasant noise, which, as you know, any 30-minute car project is one snapped bolt away from being a half-day job, so admittedly, I was a bit worried at this point. But after removing all of the bolts, inspecting each one, determining that it was all in my head, only to realize I had the O-ring installed wrong, which I assumed was the main cause of the leak to begin with, I carefully reinstalled and tightened all of the bolts until they felt snug, only to realize after needing to remove the thermostat housing not once, not twice, but on its third time, I finally saw that there was a hairline crack in the thermostat housing causing the leak. It turned out that the rather unpleasant noise that I told you guys I heard and thought was originally a snapped bolt turned out to be a cracked thermostat housing. I had installed the O-ring incorrectly the first time, which meant the thermostat and housing were unable to sit flush with the engine block, something I couldn't see when I was installing it, which resulted in too much stress on that part of the housing when I was apparently not so carefully tightening the bolts the first time I was installing everything. So, after a lesson learned, a bit of JB weld, and another trip to the store for more distilled water so I could bleed the car yet again, I had temporarily band-aided the car back together and was finally able to bring it back home. And that brings us here. In today's episode, I'm finally swapping out the cracked thermostat housing, and while we're in there, I'm also going to be installing this digital AEM Coolant Temp gauge that I picked up all the way back when I had my Porsche 944 Turbo. A car that many of you probably never saw or have even been tuned into the channel long enough to have seen the few videos I did do with that car. But in a silver lining kind of way, I suppose I'm glad I didn't follow through with the install on that car, otherwise I wouldn't have it to install here. At least not without having to buy another one, of course. You know, it's kind of funny, for as many times as I mentioned on the channel that I do this professionally, for me to only make what I'm sure many of you would agree is probably a pretty rookie mistake. I think it's pretty ironic, but you know, maybe that just goes to show that we don't know everything and that there's always an opportunity to learn. And not only that, but in my defense, I don't work on BMWs professionally. I work on a different brand, and it had probably been about 5 years since I last replaced one of these, and so I just forgot how it went. I assumed I knew, and I just didn't pay attention when I took the previous old one out, and going back in, I just, like I said, I should have looked it up. I didn't look it up, and that was my mistake. But on the off chance that any of you are unsure and maybe you're curious how it does go, the orientation, it goes thermostat, O-ring, thermostat housing. The mistake I made, which again I mentioned earlier, is I went thermostat, O-ring, thermostat, then thermostat housing. And that is not the correct way. That is exactly how you put a lot of tension on some of the bolts and on the thermostat housing, and I cracked mine as a result. But nonetheless, we have the new thermostat housing. I cleaned up that area. I am going to apply a little bit of like sealant around this thermostat housing gasket just because some of the like engine block in that area is a little corroded, and so I want to make sure that I get all the gaps and stuff sealed. Once we get this installed, we'll move on to installing all of the rest of the parts, and then I will stop and kind of update you guys on the part we're going to install with all of those new parts. But yeah, so far so good. Let's get the rest of this going. Here we go. So at this point, the engine block is cleaned up and all of the thermostat related parts are ready to go back into the car. But before they do, I'm applying a bit of sealant to the face of the thermostat housing because, as you guys saw, there is a bit of pitting on the engine block. And I'm not particularly interested in pulling this housing off again anytime soon, so this is mostly just some simple and cheap insurance. But now that the thermostat housing and all of the components underneath are installed and officially checked off today's to-do list, we can shift our attention to this part here. Simply put, this is a radiator hose joint that allows the installation of, in this case, the coolant temp sensor that will be used to relay the coolant temperature to the AEM gauge that will be installed into the car a little later in the episode. This part, similar to the AEM gauge, was purchased with the intent to go in my Porsche that I previously mentioned. So going into today's install, I was a little on the fence on whether or not this was going to fit the E36's radiator hoses, considering I bought this one specifically for another car. But after a bit of delicate surgery on my old radiator hose, thankfully, this size 32mm radiator hose joint ended up working perfect with the E36's upper radiator hose, as you can see here. So at this point, the cooling system was officially closed up and ready for more coolant, or in this case, more distilled water and a fresh bottle of water wetter. And before anyone comments trying to tell me that my car will grenade itself because of this setup, let me quickly educate you on why I'm using this mix instead of coolant. First off, water is about twice as good as coolant for heat dissipation, meaning its efficiency to remove heat from the cooling system is twice as good as coolant. Not only that, but it's generally not allowed in cars that drive on track anyways, because if something happens to your car and coolant spills onto the track surface, it can create a safety hazard because it's not only slippery, but it's also hard to clean. So the last thing I want to do is hold anyone up if something does decide to go on this car, and have everyone on standby to get out and drive due to my unwillingness to want to use something other than coolant. And yes, the distilled water does have its own drawbacks, like the potential to freeze in cold weather or cause electrolysis inside of my engine. But considering I live in Southern California where it barely even sees temperature hit the 30s, and the fact that I'm using distilled water with water wetter, I feel more than confident that the E36 should be just fine. The next day, after the E36 sat tilted slightly upwards all night, I double checked that all of the air bubbles were gone and topped off the cooling system one final time before closing it up for good. Now at this point, it was time to move inside of the M3 to start removing the onboard computer and the cubbyhole to test fit the gauge pod and come up with a plan of attack for how to fit it into the dashboard. And after a bit of finessing, this is where I landed. The gauge pod on top and the onboard computer underneath. This seemed to be the best way that these two parts wanted to fit into the dashboard without too much stress on either of the parts. But also notice that the cubbyhole and switch covers weren't with them. This is because now that we know how the OBC and gauge pod fit, now we have to do a bit of modifying to make everything work the way I want to. All right, now that we know that this fits with the onboard computer in the car, the next step is to cut the cubby hole to make room for all of that to fit together. So if you're a diehard enthusiast, I'd advise you to look away now because at this point, you have been warned. Now I can't speak for everyone, but personally, I'm not in the business of saving my cars for its next owner. In fact, I'm hardly in this business at all when it comes to this YouTube thing. But a thumbs up and a comment go a long way, so if you haven't yet, I'd appreciate either for the episode you're currently watching. And if you find yourself enjoying this episode, consider subscribing because that helps too. Now, all jokes aside, like I was saying, I'm not in the business of saving my cars for some future owner to enjoy, especially not this car. This current E36 project will be, by far, the most in-depth I have ever gone in regards of truly focusing on the driving aspect of any of my cars. And because of that, I will do everything I see fit to make this car as ready and capable for any type of driving I have planned for it, regardless of what some potential future owner may or may not think. But if you're anything like me, and if you're still tuned into the episode at this point, I can only assume you are, then you too appreciate purposeful and arguably tasteful mods for the sake of improving one's driving experience. And that's what this project is. It aims to make my driving experience a little better while also giving me the info I need to keep that driving experience going for as long as I can. Now, at this point, all that's left to do is actually connect the coolant temp sensor in the engine bay to the AEM gauge inside of the E36. So, after a bit of searching, I eventually found a way through the firewall on the passenger side of the engine bay underneath the ECU cubby, and once that was figured out, I can move my focus onto modifying the wiring harness that came with the coolant temp gauge. Now, on the topic of the wires coming from the coolant temp sensor that will be running underneath the intake plenum and ultimately through the firewall, I'm going to cover the harness in this sheathing in hopes of keeping as much moisture and debris away from the harness as possible. And hopefully it'll also keep the wires from directly touching anything hot and avoid melting as well. And by no means am I some electrical engineer or even an electrical expert when it comes to installing aftermarket parts on cars. But thankfully the circuit for this gauge was about as easy as it gets. I simply had to splice the two wires for the coolant temp gauge to some additional wires in order to add the length I needed to route the wires through the firewall into the gauge itself. And then I had to locate and tap into a ground circuit and a switched 12-volt circuit in order for the gauge to actually turn on and function. And after everything was finally hooked up and installed where it was meant to go, this is what we ended up with. Alright, just like that, the thermostat housing is replaced, the coolant temp gauge is installed, and the E36 M3 is that much closer to getting out on track for the first time. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Definitely let me know what you think of the video and the mods and everything in the comments down below. Thumbs up this video if you enjoyed any of what you saw, and of course consider subscribing because I'm trying to grow this channel. I'm trying to do cool stuff with my cars, and I think you guys would enjoy it. So definitely consider sticking around for that. Like I said, I had a good time throwing this video together. These are some things I've been putting off for some time, but I'm glad to have them done. Now we can get into some of the new parts that I bought for the car, and that stuff should be really cool. So hopefully you guys are as excited to watch that as I am to install that stuff. But yeah, if you made it to this point in the video, as usual, thank you guys for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Peace.